In this section, we'll look at some of the economic problems that Nixon faced. Indeed, as he began to be more conservative, a lot of that was in reaction to the growing economic problems. As his first term passed, the problem of inflation began to grow. In a general sense, the inflation was caused by the Great Society spending and the simultaneous spending increases for the Vietnam War. The Federal Reserve also kept to a, quote, easy money, unquote, policy of low interest rates. That meant that interest rates are low and it was easy to borrow money, so a lot of people borrowed money, and there's a lot of money around, which contributed to inflation. Nixon reacted with forceful federal intervention in a way most conservatives disliked: wage and price controls. He first implemented a 3-month freeze and then created a federal commission to set guidelines for wages and prices. The government hadn't acted so forcefully in this way really since just about World War II. Now, Nixon's rather haphazard approach did slow inflation temporarily, but it really didn't address the underlying causes. And indeed, inflation would later return with a vengeance, as we'll see. To make matters worse, even as inflation posed a threat, unemployment was growing into a significant problem. In a general sense, the unemployment resulted from a number of causes, including the fact that Europe recovered from World War II and it was now able to meet its own means. For this reason, there was less need for Europe to buy American products, and less demand for American products meant fewer jobs for American workers. Of course, rising inflation with rising unemployment wasn't usual, and people soon coined a word for it: stagflation. And as we'll see, stagflation remained a problem all the way into the early 1980s. And to complement matters even more so, all of this created in the early 1970s a trade deficit with foreign countries. Simply put, the U.S. was now spending more money for foreign goods than foreigners were spending for U.S. goods. The U.S. was losing money in trade for the first time since the late 19th century. Now, a number of factors contribute to this trade deficit. The European recovery meant that more European goods were being purchased by Americans. This meant an increase in U.S. imports. At the same time, the American inflation I just spoke of meant higher prices for U.S. goods abroad, and this meant a decrease in U.S. exports at home. The problem became more complex still. Ever since the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1945, the U.S. dollar had been considered the reserve currency of the world, and it was still redeemable in gold from the Federal Reserve. Just after World War II, with the international economy in tatters, world leaders met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and created the so-called Bretton Woods Agreement. In order to avoid confusion as nations rebuilt their economy after World War II, and to have a standard rate of exchange, Bretton Woods had made the U.S. dollar, which was on the gold standard and thus redeemable in gold, the world's so-called reserve currency. Other nations' money would float relative to the U.S. dollar, which at the time was, of course, dominant. With inflation and the drop in the value of the dollar now, however, people rush to sell their U.S. dollars for gold before the price of the dollar dropped further. And as a result, gold was flowing out of the U.S. Treasury for the first time since the Great Depression. Much of it was going abroad. In August 1971, therefore, Nixon, meeting with other world leaders at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., took the U.S. dollar off the gold standard, thereby ending the Bretton Woods Agreement. No longer was the dollar redeemable in gold. Going forward, all currencies would fluctuate in value against each other. The value of the money would depend upon confidence in the nation's governance and economy. All of these problems Nixon faced became even more complex with 1973's Yom Kippur War. I'll discuss this war in much more detail in the videos on Nixon's foreign policy, but suffice to say here that in this war, the United States supported the nation of Israel in a war against its Arab neighbors. Given America's support for Israel, Israel won that war, and this really angered the surrounding Arab countries. They had organized as part of an oil cartel known as the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, known by its acronym OPEC. And so the OPEC voted to launch an embargo of oil sales to the United States as a protest over America's support for Israel. And this is going to have a profound impact on the United States. Of course, OPEC's oil embargo meant that prices for gasoline in the United States skyrocketed. And while the embargo itself was short lived, oil prices remained high throughout the remainder of the 1970s. And when oil prices are high, gas prices are high, it costs more to transport goods. Goods cost more. It basically all feeds into another wave of inflation. I'd said earlier that inflation would get worse again, and it did for this reason. It's just going to remain a problem for the remainder of the 1970s. This is the beginning of the famed energy crisis of the 1970s, the first wave of it. And it's often signified not only by high prices, but by a shortage of gas. You'd wait in long lines, and the gas often wouldn't be run out of gas. And you can see here prices of gas are well in excess of $4 a gallon. And keep in mind, this is 40 years ago. You think about the price with inflation and so forth. Nixon, who by this point was in the middle of the Watergate scandal, which will be discussed in a future video, he was struggling to fight the crisis, and he launched what he called Project Independence. He did a number of things. Among them, he created a new energy office and worked to encourage more domestic production of oil, weakening the environmental regulations which he'd just signed, and I'll talk about that as well in a future video. He also sought to promote more conservation of oil, which included a new 55-mile-per-hour speed limit. On the interstates prior to that, the speed limit had been 70 miles an hour. Many states began to ration gasoline as the supplies ran out. You see them using things like license plate numbers to say you can only buy gas on certain days of the week given the license plates numbers you had. In any event, this energy crisis and the inflation that's attendant to it is going to be raging when Nixon resigns office in the Watergate scandal, and the whole problem sort of going to be handed off to a successor, Gerald Ford. This concludes the section on Nixon's economic problems.